He sat down for dinner, and two girls with his eyes and his birthmark walked up and said, "We think you're our dad." What they told him next changed everything. Graham Lawson had everything a man could want, at least, that's what the headline said. Billionaire CEO. Biotech innovator. One of the most powerful men in America, according to 3 different magazines. He was the kind of man who made people lower their voices when he entered the room. His sharp blue eyes could freeze a conversation mid-sentence, and the slight curl in his dark hair gave him a look that was both effortless and intimidating. He spoke only when necessary, smiled even less, and lived in a high-rise apartment that had more glass than furniture. Every inch of his life was polished, curated, and impenetrable. Just the way he liked it. To the world, Graham was an untouchable force of nature. But what they didn't see was how empty the silence became once the boardroom lights were off. They didn't see how he sat in his penthouse every night, sipping scotch he barely tasted, staring out over a city he helped shape but no longer understood. There were no picture frames in his home. No family photos. No childhood memories. He told himself that was by design, that cutting out the past made him sharper, faster, stronger. But some nights, that silence turned into a weight so heavy it pressed into his chest until he couldn't breathe. There had been one person who got close, Avery Moore. A brilliant, fire-hearted researcher who challenged him in meetings and left handwritten notes on his desk instead of emails. She was unlike anyone he'd ever known, warm but not weak, bold but never loud. She didn't care about his money. Didn't need it. They were together for almost 2 years, and for a moment in time, Graham actually believed in something softer than ambition. But then, just like that, she was gone. No fight. No final words. Just a note that read, "I have to go. Please don't follow me." And he didn't. Not because he didn't care, but because it shattered him more than he was willing to admit. In the 6 years since, Graham buried that part of himself. He told no one. Not even his assistant, who probably knew more about his life than his own family once had. He poured everything into work, into empire building, into staying so busy that he didn't have time to ask the one question that haunted him every night: what happened to her? On paper, he had built a perfect life. But perfection is a fragile thing, and all it takes is one crack for everything underneath to start seeping through. And the crack was coming. He just didn't know it yet. It was a Thursday evening, the kind that fell heavy and slow over the city like a velvet curtain. The sun had already sunk behind the skyline, leaving only a haze of orange lingering on the tips of skyscrapers. Graham Lawson had just left another board meeting that ended in applause and backpats, the kind of performance he could now execute with his eyes closed. He didn't linger. He never did. Success, to him, was a rhythm, predictable, efficient, unfeeling. His driver knew the routine. No small talk. Straight to the rooftop restaurant tucked away in a private corner of the city, where the maitre d' greeted Graham by name and whisked him to his usual table without a menu. The restaurant was exclusive, quiet, designed for people who wanted elegance without intrusion. It was one of the few places where Graham could sit alone and not be bothered. That night, the lighting was soft, the music tasteful, and the wine chilled exactly how he liked it. His steak arrived medium rare, and he opened his tablet, diving into numbers and projections like he did every night. He had just taken his second bite when it happened. 2 small figures appeared at the edge of his vision, standing quietly by his table. At first, he didn't look up. He assumed it was a staff member's child, maybe a brief distraction that would be handled by management in seconds. But the silence stretched. There was no adult. No movement. Just stillness. He raised his eyes. They were girls. Young. Maybe 6 years old. They stood shoulder to shoulder, identical in height and build, with long dark curls falling in soft waves past their shoulders. Their clothes were neat but simple, matching dresses in pale yellow with tiny blue bows at the collar. But what struck him immediately, what froze the breath in his lungs, were their eyes. Bright, piercing blue. His blue. For a few seconds, the world blurred around the edges. Everything, the candlelight, the clinking of dishes, the faint hum of a jazz piano, faded into background noise. He blinked, unsure if this was some sort of hallucination or trick of the mind. Then one of the girls stepped forward. "Mr. Lawson," she said, voice small but clear. "We have something to show you." Graham didn't respond. Couldn't. His hands were suddenly cold against the tablecloth. The second girl, mirroring the first, rolled up the sleeve of her dress. The first followed. On each of their left wrists, a small crescent-shaped birthmark curved like a shadow of the moon. His heart skipped. He had the same mark. It wasn't something visible in suits and cufflinks, but it was there, etched into him since birth, something his mother used to call, "your little moon." He had always hated it. Thought it made him look flawed. But now, seeing it duplicated on these two little girls, he felt like the earth had tilted under him. They stood there, silent, eyes searching his. Not afraid. Not begging. Just waiting. He heard himself speak, though the voice didn't sound like his own. "Where's your mother?" One of them, Emma, though he didn't yet know her name, reached into a small purse slung over her shoulder and pulled out an envelope. She handed it to him with both hands, then stepped back beside her sister. The envelope was worn at the corners. His name was written on it in familiar, slanted handwriting. Avery's. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Inside, a letter. 1 page. No introduction, no apology. Just the truth, delivered in Avery's steady, thoughtful voice, even from the grave. Asterisk, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And they've found you. Their names are Sophie and Emma. They're 6. They are yours. Asterisk. Graham stared at the words. His vision blurred. The paper trembled. Asterisk, I never stopped loving you. But I had my reasons. You don't have to forgive me. Just please, take care of them. If nothing else, let them know they're not alone. Asterisk. He folded the letter with shaking hands and looked up at the girls again. Still standing there. Still watching him. They had the same eyes. The same birthmark. And now he knew. Knew with the kind of certainty that doesn't ask for DNA tests or legal documents. They were his. He didn't remember standing. He didn't remember leaving his food, his tablet, or his coat behind. He only remembered reaching out his hand, and the moment Sophie took it without hesitation. That night, Graham Lawson walked out of a restaurant a different man than the one who had entered. He walked out not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, not as a man in control of every variable. He walked out as a father. And he had no idea what to do next. The ride home was silent. Not the tense kind of silence, not uncomfortable, but thick with unspoken thoughts, questions too big for the moment, and emotions Graham wasn't ready to name. The girls sat in the back of the car, side by side, hands folded neatly in their laps, their feet barely touching the floor. They didn't ask where they were going. They didn't seem afraid. And somehow, that made it even harder to process. He kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror, as if expecting them to disappear, like a dream that made too much sense to be real. Back at his penthouse, the space felt too large, too cold, too adult for the presence of 2 small children. The lights flickered on automatically, revealing polished stone floors, high ceilings, and walls bare of any warmth. He realized for the first time just how sterile his life had become. Not a single photo. Not a single toy. Not a single soft surface. This was a place built for solitude, not for children. And now 2 of them stood in his foyer, looking around like they were visiting a museum. He gestured awkwardly toward the living room, not quite sure what to say. "Make yourselves comfortable," he offered, knowing how ridiculous it sounded the moment it left his mouth. Sophie gave him a small, polite nod and guided her sister forward, the protector even in unfamiliar territory. Emma clutched the small purse she'd brought and scanned the room with quiet curiosity. She looked at everything, but touched nothing. Graham stood there for a long moment, frozen. He had faced down hostile investors, courtroom interrogations, government regulators, but this? This was terrifying. And it was only the beginning. Eventually, he excused himself and retreated to his office, not to work, but to breathe. He sat at his desk, opened the letter again, and read it 5 times, as if hoping the ink would rearrange itself into something easier to digest. The words didn't change. They never would. She'd kept this from him. Avery. He remembered the way she used to laugh when he got too serious. The way she could read his moods before he even knew he had one. She had always been so in control of herself, so deliberate in her choices. And now he understood, leaving had been one of them. Not just leaving him, but keeping the girls away. Keeping him in the dark. He wanted to be angry. He was angry. But beneath it was something else. Something heavier. Regret. For all the birthdays he missed. For the first steps, the first words, the skinned knees and lullabies he never got to sing. 6 years. Gone. He returned to the living room to find them exactly where he'd left them, sitting politely on the edge of the couch, hands still folded in their laps like they were waiting for someone to tell them what came next. He felt a pang so sharp it nearly buckled him. He sat across from them, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. Neither of them answered right away. Then Sophie, the braver of the two, tilted her head slightly and asked, "Do you want us to stay here?" He looked at her, those impossibly blue eyes, that mix of caution and courage, and felt something catch in his throat. "I think I need you to," he said, voice rough. Emma finally spoke then. "Just one word." "Okay." It was so simple. So innocent. And it broke him wide open. That night, he gave them the guest room down the hall, not because it was ready, but because it had the softest mattress. He brought in extra blankets and set up a nightlight, unsure if they'd want it on. They thanked him, both of them, in those soft, careful voices that made it clear they were used to managing the feelings of adults. He stood outside their door for a long time after they'd gone to bed, listening to them whisper and giggle under the covers. Not afraid. Just small girls in a too big world. He didn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He was supposed to have everything. But now he saw the truth. What he'd built meant nothing if it couldn't hold the people who mattered. For the first time in years, Graham Lawson had someone to lose. And the weight of that truth was more terrifying, and more beautiful, than anything he'd ever known. Morning arrived slowly, bleeding in through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Graham's penthouse, illuminating the stillness of a home that had never truly been lived in. But this morning, something was different. There were traces of life in the air, small things, barely noticeable to anyone else. A pair of tiny socks left in the hallway. A crumpled napkin on the coffee table. Faint giggling behind a closed door. Graham hadn't slept. Not really. He had dozed in the armchair by the window, haunted by the weight of what had happened, what was happening, and what he now had to become. Father. The word didn't feel real in his mouth, even as it echoed again and again in his mind. 6 years lost. 2 girls, with his eyes, his mark on their skin, sleeping under his roof. And Avery, gone. He got up slowly, stretching limbs that felt heavier than usual. As he passed the hallway to the guest room, he paused. The door was cracked open. Inside, he saw Emma curled against her sister's side, thumb tucked near her mouth, hair splayed like a halo on the pillow. Sophie was already awake, sitting up, arms wrapped around her knees, staring out the window. She noticed him, but didn't say anything. He gave her a small nod, and she returned it with one of her own. That simple exchange said more than any words could have. He made breakfast. Or at least, he tried. The kitchen was designed by professionals but never used. He burnt the toast, undercooked the eggs, and gave up on the idea of making pancakes halfway through. Eventually, he settled for pouring cereal into mismatched bowls and slicing a few pieces of fruit. When he set everything on the table, it looked oddly like something real. Something domestic. Something normal. The girls came out together, hand in hand. Emma rubbed her eyes. Sophie was quiet, but alert. They sat, murmured soft thank yous, and began eating. No one spoke for a while, and for once, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt tentative, but alive. Like a new song just beginning to play. After breakfast, Graham took a deep breath and did the one thing he knew he had to do next. He called his lawyers. The legal situation was a minefield. There was no formal record linking him to the girls yet. Avery had left the DNA results, yes, but that wasn't the same as filing for custody. If anyone contested his role, if family stepped in, if the state decided to intervene, it could all spiral out of his control. That possibility shook him more than he expected. He didn't just want them safe. He wanted them with him. Permanently. His legal team, as always, moved quickly. But even they couldn't work miracles overnight. They advised him to lay low, not alert any external parties yet. No media. No public appearances with the girls. Not until the process started. In the meantime, they would begin drafting custody petitions and running background checks to make sure there were no legal surprises waiting to pounce. Graham thanked them, then hung up and leaned against the edge of the kitchen counter, suddenly overwhelmed. His world had always been numbers, control, precision. This was none of those things. This was two small humans depending on him for everything. This was schedules, emotions, school forms, scraped knees, bedtime stories, nightmares. This was real life. By midday, he realized he needed help. He couldn't do this alone, not without turning the transition into a trauma for them. So he did something he hadn't done in years, he asked for support. Not from friends, he didn't have many, but from the one person he trusted implicitly. Monica, his personal assistant, showed up within the hour. She was sharp, unshakable, and fiercely loyal. She took one look at the girls, then turned to Graham with a raised brow and said, "Well, that explains the 3 missed calls and the tone in your voice." He gave her the short version: Avery, the letter, the birthmarks, the DNA. Monica said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then she nodded once, adjusted her blazer, and said, "Okay. We've got work to do." They spent the rest of the afternoon reworking the penthouse. Monica made calls, ordered essentials, clothes, books, toys, furniture. Sophie and Emma followed her around shyly at first, but within an hour, Emma was helping unpack boxes and Sophie had claimed a corner of the guest room as her reading spot. Graham watched all of it from the hallway, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. He didn't feel in control, but he didn't feel lost either. He felt included. That night, he read to them. He wasn't sure how to pick a book, so he asked. Emma pointed to a story about a bear who lost his family and found a new one in the woods. Graham read slowly, his voice catching in places he didn't expect. The girls didn't notice. Or maybe they did, but chose not to say anything. When the lights were out and they were tucked under fresh blankets, he lingered at the door. "Do you want me to leave it open?" he asked softly. Sophie looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Just a little." So he left it open. Just a little. Later that night, alone again in the quiet of his room, he sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the envelope Avery had left. The handwriting. The weight of the paper. The finality of it all. It still didn't feel real. And yet, in the next room, two pieces of that reality were breathing, dreaming, alive. Graham Lawson was many things: a billionaire, a leader, a man who built walls around his heart and called them strategy. But that night, he was just a father, listening through a crack in the door to make sure his daughters were still there. And promising himself he would never let them go. The next week unfolded like a strange dream, one that drifted between wonder and quiet panic. Every morning Graham woke up with the same thought: they were still here. Sophie and Emma. His daughters. It was a fact he repeated to himself often, not because he doubted it, but because saying it helped him catch up to the reality that was moving faster than he could process. He had gone from solitary routines and boardroom presentations to school runs, spilled juice, bedtime negotiations, and two little girls who seemed to grow more real to him with every passing hour. He started learning their rhythms. Sophie liked order. She made her bed every morning without being asked, lined up her shoes perfectly by the door, and always double-checked her sister's backpack. She was cautious, always a little tense, as if still bracing for the moment when this new world would fall apart. Emma, on the other hand, was a wanderer, curious, imaginative, endlessly full of questions. She would trail behind him asking things like why clouds didn't fall, or whether bears had birthdays, or if pancakes were better on Sundays than Saturdays. Her mind was always spinning, and Graham found himself wanting to follow her thoughts just to remember what it felt like to wonder without limits. He tried to keep up, but the truth was, he was in over his head. He read parenting articles at night, scribbled notes to himself about routines, nutrition, bedtime consistency, emotional validation, whatever that meant, and still felt like he was failing. The girls weren't asking for perfection. But inside, he was terrified of messing this up. Of giving them a glimpse of something safe, only to have it taken away again. He was also terrified of something far more vulnerable, that he was starting to love them in ways he hadn't known he was capable of. It was in the middle of this slow transformation, just as Graham began feeling a fragile confidence, that the first wave of threat rolled in. It came in the form of a letter, delivered by courier, printed on expensive legal stationery. The name at the top made his blood freeze: Daniel Moore. Avery's brother. He hadn't seen Daniel in years, not since before she left. Back then, the man was already bitter, controlling, deeply judgmental of her choices. Graham had never liked him. Avery rarely spoke of him. Now, it seemed, Daniel had discovered that his sister had passed, and that her children were with Graham. The letter was brief but sharp, a formal request for custody evaluation. Daniel believed he was the rightful guardian. He claimed Graham was unfit, emotionally unavailable, and never involved in their upbringing. Worse, the letter hinted at possible media exposure if Graham didn't respond. Graham stood in his office staring at the paper, rage rising like a tide. He wasn't afraid of a courtroom, but this wasn't about business. This was about Sophie and Emma. About their home, their safety, their future. And someone wanted to rip it away. He called Monica first. Then his lawyers. His team activated instantly, pulling public records, establishing timelines, gathering witness statements from Avery's colleagues who had known about the girl's birth. Monica found an old email from Avery to a close friend, one where she said clearly that Graham had no idea he was a father, and that she planned to tell him when the time was right. It was something. It wasn't enough. The hardest part came that evening, when Graham had to tell the girls that something might be changing. They were sitting on the floor, putting together a jigsaw puzzle, Emma humming softly, Sophie deep in focus. He crouched beside them, his voice gentle. "There's something I need to talk to you about," he said. They looked up. Both stopped moving. "Your mom's brother, Daniel, he found out you're with me. He thinks you should live with him instead." For a moment, the room felt hollow. Sophie's eyes darkened. Emma blinked, confused. "Do we have to go?" Emma asked, voice trembling. "No," he said quickly. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you stay right here." Sophie didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, she said, "He yelled at Mommy. A lot. We used to hide under the table when he visited." Graham felt his chest tighten. "She didn't like him," Sophie added. "She told us, if anything ever happened, we should find you." That night, Graham sat at his desk long after the girls had gone to sleep, staring at the birth certificates, the medical forms, the scribbled artwork that now covered his refrigerator. He wasn't fighting for custody. He was fighting for his daughters. For their peace. For the right to be the father they had already chosen. He didn't care how long the legal battle would take, or how ugly it would get. He had made up his mind. They were not going anywhere. And neither was he. The courtroom was colder than Graham expected, not just in temperature, but in tone. Sterile walls, muted lighting, and rows of benches made everything feel distant and impersonal, as if the fate of two small children wasn't about to be debated in front of strangers. He sat at the long table beside his legal team, wearing a suit that suddenly felt more like armor than attire. Across from him sat Daniel Moore, shoulders squared with artificial confidence, eyes scanning the room like a predator waiting to strike. He looked nothing like Avery. There was no warmth in his face, no trace of the woman Graham once loved. Just ego and entitlement wrapped in a practiced frown. Sophie and Emma weren't present. Graham had insisted they stay home with Monica. They didn't need to hear strangers dissect their lives like a business transaction. But their absence didn't make it easier. In fact, it made it worse. Every argument, every accusation thrown at him, felt like a threat echoing into the rooms they now slept in. The girls had finally started calling the penthouse home, and this man, this stranger, wanted to take that away. Daniel's lawyer spoke first. He presented documents. Old photographs. Statements from distant relatives who barely knew the girls. He painted Daniel as the only blood relative fit to care for them, someone with a longing to reconnect and a deep familial bond. Graham's stomach turned at the performance. The truth was that Daniel had never once reached out, not to Avery, not to the girls. And yet here he was, claiming a right that biology alone did not grant. Then came the character attacks. Cold, calculated hits to Graham's reputation. The lawyer called him emotionally detached, career-obsessed, financially generous but personally distant. They referenced articles from years past that described him as ruthless, unfeeling, robotic. And Graham sat through it all, jaw tight, fists clenched beneath the table, because none of it mattered if he couldn't prove who he was now. When it was his turn to speak, Graham stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the center of the room. He didn't hold papers. Didn't read from a script. He looked directly at the judge. "I never knew I had children," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "Not because I didn't care. Because I wasn't told." He paused, letting the silence fill the space. "When I met Sophie and Emma, they didn't ask me for anything. Not toys. Not money. Not love. They didn't expect it. Which tells me they've lived without it for longer than they should have. But they're not just surviving anymore. They're becoming who they're meant to be. They sing. They ask questions. They sleep through the night. They laugh. They trust." His voice faltered slightly, just enough to reveal what was underneath. "I've spent my life building things. Companies. Teams. Legacies. But none of that means anything if I can't protect the only thing that really matters now, my daughters. I'm not perfect. But I show up. Every day. And I'll never stop." There was a stillness in the courtroom when he sat back down. For the first time, Daniel didn't smirk. He looked uncomfortable. Exposed. Then the judge did something unexpected. He asked to speak with the girls. Graham's lawyer hesitated but nodded. They arranged for the girls to come in the next morning for a private conversation in chambers. It wasn't about questioning them, it was about hearing their hearts, directly, without legal translation. The next morning, Graham sat in the waiting room outside the judge's office while Sophie and Emma went in. He wasn't allowed to hear what was said. But when they came out, Sophie looked calm, composed, like she'd said exactly what needed to be said. Emma climbed into his lap without a word and rested her head on his chest. That was all he needed to know. Later that afternoon, the judge returned to the courtroom and delivered the ruling. Full custody would be granted to Graham Lawson. Permanently. There were no dramatic gasps. No thunderous reactions. Just a quiet shift in the air, like gravity had settled in the right direction. Daniel stormed out before the final sentence was even spoken, his face tight with defeat. Graham didn't watch him go. He didn't care. He turned to his legal team, shook hands out of habit, thanked them mechanically. But his mind was already at home, already picturing the girls sitting in their pajamas, waiting for a bedtime story. That night, when he walked through the door, they ran to him before he could even take off his coat. Sophie wrapped her arms around his waist, and Emma tugged his hand toward the living room where they had already laid out a book and 2 blankets. Graham sat between them, reading through pages he didn't quite finish, because halfway through, both girls fell asleep against his sides, warm and heavy and safe. And in that moment, he knew that no matter how much he had achieved in his life, nothing would ever come close to this. They were his. And he was theirs. The months that followed settled into a rhythm that was both unfamiliar and strangely natural, as if Graham had spent his whole life preparing for something he didn't even know he wanted. The penthouse no longer felt sterile. The sharp, minimalist lines of the interior were softened with blankets draped over couches, art projects taped proudly to walls, and the sound of 2 little girls filling every corner. There were fingerprints on glass doors, mismatched socks in hallways, and crayon markings on the edge of his otherwise perfect marble countertop. And for the first time in his adult life, he didn't care. In fact, he found comfort in the mess, in the beautiful, chaotic proof that life was finally being lived here. Sophie and Emma bloomed. There was no other word for it. They had come into his life quiet, careful, and watchful. Now they laughed more easily, asked for things without apologizing, and fell asleep without needing to check that he was still nearby. Sophie began writing stories, small, thoughtful pieces about brave girls and magical forests. She kept them in a blue notebook and let Graham read them every Sunday night. Emma started drawing her own versions of the characters, taping them to the refrigerator with sparkly stickers. Their imaginations grew bolder every day, and Graham did his best to keep up, even if that meant sitting through elaborate performances of made-up plays or helping design official princess detective badges out of cardboard and ribbon. Graham's own life shifted in ways that couldn't be measured on spreadsheets. He began spending less time in boardrooms and more time in classrooms, parent-teacher meetings, art shows, school plays. He learned how to braid hair with clumsy fingers, how to explain multiplication in a way that made it sound like magic, and how to sit on the floor for hours building puzzles that tested his patience more than any corporate merger ever had. He wasn't just parenting. He was connecting. And in the process, he was being remade. Professionally, he took a step back. He no longer chased growth for the sake of growth. His company ran well without him at the helm every single day. Instead, he poured his time and resources into something new, something rooted in love, not ambition. He founded the Avery Foundation, in honor of the woman who had carried so much of the weight alone. The organization focused on supporting single mothers, families in crisis, and children without stable homes. It was his way of saying thank you to Avery. And of making sure her daughters knew her legacy was alive in more than just memory. The girls were involved from the very beginning. Sophie helped name the foundation. Emma picked the colors for the logo, shades of blue and green, because those are peaceful, she said. Graham included them in meetings when he could, letting them see how their story could ripple outward to help others. People reached out from all over the country, sharing letters, photos, even their own stories of reconnecting with lost family. It was bigger than he expected, and yet it felt entirely personal. What surprised Graham the most was how easily he let go of the man he used to be. There was no mourning for his old life, no longing for the silence or the solitude. That world had been made of glass, beautiful but fragile, cold and empty. This new life, though unpredictable and often exhausting, had weight and texture and meaning. He no longer measured success by net worth or quarterly returns. He measured it by giggles during bedtime stories, by how tightly Emma held his hand in parking lots, by the way Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder when they watched movies. One night, long after the girls had gone to bed and the city had gone quiet, Graham stood on the balcony and looked out over the skyline. It glittered with the same brilliance it always had, but something about it felt smaller now. Or maybe he had just grown bigger, bigger in the ways that mattered. He thought about everything it took to get here, the loss, the shock, the fear. He thought about Avery and the impossible choices she made. And most of all, he thought about two girls with identical birthmarks who had walked into a restaurant one night and, without even realizing it, handed him back his heart. He had spent a lifetime building a future. And now, finally, he was living in it. The morning of their 7th birthday began with sunlight pouring through the curtains and the smell of cinnamon drifting through the apartment. Graham had woken up early, earlier than usual, with a quiet buzz of nerves in his chest. He wasn't a man easily shaken. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals under pressure, stood before entire auditoriums with poise, but this was different. This mattered more than any quarterly report or market win. Today wasn't about celebration for celebration's sake. It was about presence. About showing two little girls that someone remembered. That someone cared. That they mattered, fully and completely. The kitchen was a mess. Flour on the counters, sticky batter on his sleeves, the oven beeping every few minutes like a reminder that he still had no business baking unsupervised. But he didn't care. He was making them a cake himself, the way he'd promised weeks ago. Sophie had requested vanilla with strawberries. Emma had insisted on chocolate chips. So he'd found a way to do both. The result wasn't elegant, it sagged a little on one side, and the frosting looked like it had been applied by someone wearing a blindfold, but it was made with real effort, and he knew they'd see that. By the time the girls woke up, the living room had been transformed. Balloons floated in clusters, strung with ribbons across the ceiling. A paper banner that read, "Happy Birthday Sophie and Emma," in his own messy handwriting hung above the couch. Gifts were stacked in a pile by the window, not expensive gadgets or flashy toys, but things that meant something, books they'd talked about, sketchpads, a set of walkie-talkies they'd seen at the store and whispered about like they were spy gear. A new set of pajamas with matching moon patterns, because they still loved falling asleep in the same bed some nights, especially when it rained. When they saw it all, they didn't scream with excitement or run wildly through the room. They just stood in the doorway for a moment, still in their pajamas, eyes wide and shining. Then they turned to him, slowly, as if making sure this wasn't a dream. He knelt down and opened his arms, and they both ran into them at once. No words, no overreactions. Just 3 heartbeats aligning in one quiet embrace. The rest of the day unfolded in bursts of color and warmth. There was laughter, cake everywhere, frosting on noses and cheeks. Monica stopped by with party hats and a handmade card that Emma declared was the most beautiful thing ever. A few friends from school arrived with their parents for a small, backyard-style gathering on the rooftop garden. There were games, music, and stories, and Graham stood off to the side for a while, just watching, trying to take it all in without blinking too much. Because every moment felt precious, like something that could vanish if he didn't hold onto it tightly enough. That evening, after the last guest had left and the sky had turned to soft shades of purple and gold, Graham called the girls into the living room one more time. He handed them each a small velvet box. Inside were matching silver lockets, simple and elegant, engraved with their initials on the front. Inside each locket, he had placed a tiny photo of the three of them together, taken only a few weeks ago. On the opposite side, engraved in delicate script, was the same phrase in both. "You are my always." Sophie stared at hers for a long time, running her fingers over the engraving. Emma immediately opened hers, smiled, then closed it and clutched it to her chest. They looked up at him at the same time. Sophie's voice was quiet when she spoke. "We weren't sure what to call you before." Emma nodded beside her. "Yeah. We didn't know if it was okay." Graham swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "But now," Sophie continued, "can we call you Dad?" He couldn't speak at first. His heart was too full, his throat too tight. So he simply nodded, and pulled them both into his arms again, holding them so close it felt like he was anchoring his soul to something solid for the first time in his life. That night, after they had fallen asleep, Sophie with her notebook beside her pillow, Emma still wearing her locket, Graham stood in the doorway and just watched them breathe. The city beyond the window glittered quietly, but it no longer felt like the center of the world. The center of his world was right there. Two small girls with matching curls, matching birthmarks, and a love so pure it had completely rewritten who he was. He thought back to the man he used to be. Sharp edges. Empty apartment. Long nights and longer silences. And then he thought of the moment he saw those girls standing in a restaurant, showing him something he didn't know he was missing. They hadn't just told him the truth that night. They'd saved him with it. What makes this story linger long after the final page isn't just the transformation of a powerful man, it's the quiet, undeniable truth that love has a way of finding us, even when we've spent years hiding from it. Graham Lawson didn't just gain daughters, he rediscovered his humanity. He learned that real strength isn't in control or achievement, but in vulnerability, in presence, in choosing to stay. It's not a fairy tale. It's something better. It's a reminder that healing often arrives disguised as responsibility, that family can begin in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes, the people who save us are the ones we never saw coming. By 39, Ethan Cole had everything: money, fame, power. But no one ever asked why a man with it all spent his nights staring at the ceiling, wide awake, choking on a silence that no amount of success could fill. The night he saw three boys huddled around a trash fire changed nothing about his status. But it changed everything about his soul. Ethan Cole had everything a man was supposed to want. At 39, he was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech empire, the kind of company that shaped the future. His face had graced the cover of Fortune, Forbes, and every other magazine that worshipped genius and wealth. His hair was always perfectly styled, his tailored suits cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his smile, calculated, camera-ready, never faltered in front of the world. But behind the tinted windows of his blacked-out SUV, behind the penthouse glass that looked out over the San Francisco skyline, Ethan Cole was a man hollowed out from the inside. He woke up each morning in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort but claws. No footsteps down the hall. No laughter. Just the low hum of smart devices, the mechanical sweep of blinds opening to a city that meant nothing to him anymore. His assistants worshipped him, investors feared him, and competitors envied him. But not one person truly knew him. That suited Ethan just fine, or at least that's what he told himself. Success, he had discovered, was an excellent distraction. For a while. It drowned out the memories. The ones of his mother curled up on the floor, shaking from withdrawal. The sound of sirens. The nights he went to bed hungry, the car's ceiling above him, sagging and stained. He buried that child under layers of luxury and logic. But some ghosts don't stay buried. Late at night, when the parties ended and the lights dimmed, Ethan would sit on his rooftop terrace with a glass of something expensive and stare at the stars, wondering how the hell he still felt so cold. He had built everything from the ground up, his company, his image, his fortune. And yet, there was a weight in his chest he couldn't shake. Something nameless and heavy, like a locked door deep inside that he'd forgotten how to open. His therapist once asked him when he last felt joy. Not excitement. Not accomplishment. Joy. Ethan didn't have an answer. People thought power was intoxicating. And it was, for a time. But eventually, it just became another routine. Just another game to win. The boardroom victories, the viral speeches, the standing ovations, they were all hollow echoes in a room that never filled. That December night, when everything began to shift, Ethan wasn't planning to stop. He was being driven home after another gala, another photo op with people he didn't care about, in a tuxedo that felt like a costume. But something in him, some instinct, some forgotten human itch, told him to take a walk. He asked the driver to pull over near the old train station, a part of the city that had been left behind, much like everything else Ethan had tried to forget. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting the lungs. His polished shoes clicked against the cracked pavement as he walked, hands deep in his coat pockets. And then, he saw them. 3 small figures, curled up against the side of a burned-out convenience store. They were bundled in tattered jackets, leaning into each other for warmth. A faint orange glow flickered near them, a makeshift fire in a rusted can. One of the boys looked up, just for a second. Big eyes. Hollow cheeks. Maybe 7 years old. Ethan's steps slowed. His breath caught. Something twisted in his chest, something ancient and raw. He stood there, frozen, watching them. They didn't move. Didn't ask for help. Didn't beg. They just existed. Like this was normal. Like this was life. Ethan turned and walked back to the car, his face unreadable. But something had cracked. And that crack was about to change everything. The next morning, Ethan Cole sat at the long glass dining table in his penthouse, a steaming cup of black coffee untouched in front of him. The city buzzed far below, but the sound couldn't reach him. Everything inside his home was too quiet, too pristine, like a museum curated for someone who never truly lived there. He stared at the skyline, but all he saw were those 3 boys, curled into each other beside that rusted barrel of fire. The way the smallest one trembled. The way the oldest tried to pull his arms around the others, like he could shield them from the cold and the world all at once. It wasn't pity Ethan felt. It was recognition. He didn't speak of it during his morning briefing. Didn't bring it up while his assistant listed investor updates and board expectations. He sat through every meeting, nodded at all the right moments, but the echo of those children's eyes followed him like a shadow. They had been silent, but somehow louder than anything else in his day. By late afternoon, he couldn't take it anymore. He canceled a dinner with a major VC and told his driver to take him back to the station. No security detail. No press. Just him. The sun was dipping low by the time he arrived, casting long shadows over the cracked concrete and graffiti-tagged walls. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe that they'd be gone. Maybe that it had all been a product of a tired mind and too many ghosts. But they were still there. All 3. In the exact same place, like time hadn't moved for them at all. This time, he didn't just stand there. He walked toward them slowly, careful not to startle them. The middle boy noticed him first and gave a nudge to the others. They all looked up in unison, wary, as if they were preparing to run. Ethan stopped a few feet away and crouched down to their level, keeping his hands visible. He didn't say anything right away. He didn't have the words. So instead, he opened the bag he brought and took out a simple brown paper sack. Inside was warm food, sandwiches, fruit, bottled water. Nothing fancy. Just enough to say, "I saw you." He placed the bag on the ground and gently slid it toward them. They didn't move. He didn't press them. After a few long moments, the oldest boy reached out and grabbed the sack. He didn't thank Ethan. He didn't smile. But he didn't run, either. That was enough. Ethan stood up, backed away, and sat on a broken bench across the street. He didn't watch them directly, just sat there in the cold for almost an hour. When he glanced over again, the boys were eating. Still huddled together, still silent. But eating. And alive. He returned the next day. And the day after. He brought more food. Blankets. Socks. He never asked questions. Never forced a conversation. He just kept showing up, each day stripping a little more of the executive armor he wore like a second skin. Something inside him began to shift, something slow, something cautious, but something very real. By the fourth day, the oldest boy spoke. "What do you want?" Ethan blinked. The voice was small, roughened by cold and maybe by distrust. But it wasn't hostile. It was tired. And honest. "I don't want anything," Ethan said after a moment. "Just, maybe you could use some help." The boy looked at him for a long time. Then turned his eyes back to the fire. "My name's Aiden," he muttered. "That's Jasper. And Leo." He didn't offer a last name. Ethan didn't ask. He only nodded, heart thudding louder than it had in years. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole didn't feel like a ghost walking through his own life. He felt present. Awake. And whether he knew it yet or not, he had just stepped across a line he could never uncross. It didn't take long for the rhythm to form. Each day, Ethan would arrive at the same time, just before sunset, carrying something in his hands, food, clean clothes, small things he remembered needing when he was a kid with no one looking out for him. And each day, the boys began to meet him a little closer, speak a little more, trust just enough to let him stay longer. It wasn't fast. It wasn't simple. But it was real. The more time he spent with them, the clearer the picture became. Aiden was the one who always positioned himself in front. He watched Ethan with quiet, calculating eyes that seemed far older than 7. He didn't smile easily, but he listened. Jasper spoke rarely, usually through nods or short, clipped phrases, but he was always observing. And Leo was different. He had a softness in his face that the streets hadn't yet hardened, a kind of hope that hadn't been beaten out of him. He smiled once at Ethan when he brought them hot chocolate, and Ethan felt something stir in his chest that he didn't have a name for. One evening, as they sat near a broken-down bus stop, the boys began to talk more freely, sharing pieces of themselves in fragments, like puzzle pieces scattered across the sidewalk. Aiden mentioned their mother for the first time, not by name, but as she. Said she got sick in a shelter. Said there was a fire. Said she didn't make it. After that, no one came. No one asked where they'd go. And eventually, the people around them just stopped looking at them at all. They told Ethan they'd been sleeping in alleys, behind dumpsters, in stairwells when they could find one. They didn't trust shelters. Too many bad people. Too many fights. One of them had almost been taken once. Jasper didn't say a word for a week after that. Since then, Aiden kept them close. Always. He knew how to disappear. How to make them invisible. Ethan listened, not as a CEO, not as someone with an agenda, but as a man who once knew what it felt like to be forgotten. He didn't offer false promises or pity. He just stayed. Something about the way the boys moved together got to him. They weren't just surviving, they were protecting one another with everything they had. It was instinctual, unspoken. When Aiden handed Leo the bigger half of a sandwich, when Jasper pulled his sleeve over Leo's hand to keep it warm, when they fell asleep piled on top of each other like puppies in a nest, Ethan felt the weight of their love. It was stronger than anything he had seen in any boardroom ordeal. And he began to realize something else: he was starting to care. Not in the abstract, not as a donor or a good Samaritan, but personally. Deeply. These boys were slipping into his heart with each passing day, and it terrified him. Because caring meant risk. Caring meant responsibility. And Ethan Cole, for all his wealth, had never truly let himself be responsible for another human being. Not like this. He found himself waking up in the middle of the night, wondering if they were warm enough. He stopped answering calls during dinner hours, just so he could spend more time with them. He began carrying their names in his chest like a quiet prayer, as if saying them out loud might anchor them more firmly in his life. And then came the night Leo fell asleep with his head in Ethan's lap. No words. No permission asked. Just a tired little boy, surrendering to safety he hadn't known in years. Ethan sat there, still as stone, watching the firelight flicker over the cracked pavement, one hand resting lightly on Leo's back. He didn't move for over an hour. That night, he didn't go back to the penthouse. He sat in his car, engine off, and stared out at the empty road. Something was breaking open inside him. Something old and aching and necessary. And though he didn't say it out loud, Ethan Cole already knew. He couldn't walk away from them. Not now. Not ever. It started with whispers in the executive wing. People noticed the changes before Ethan even acknowledged them himself. He began showing up late to meetings, distracted, with a look in his eyes that no one could quite place. The man who used to dominate every room with precision and focus now seemed preoccupied, half present, as if some part of him had already stepped into another life. Board members exchanged glances behind his back. His assistant, Monica, asked if he was okay more than once. He always said he was fine. He wasn't lying. He just didn't know how to explain that for the first time in years, he was thinking about someone other than himself. One morning, he sat in his office, staring at a performance report he didn't care about. Aiden's voice kept echoing in his mind from the night before: "We don't go to shelters. They split you up." That single sentence had haunted him, because it was filled with a kind of fear and experience no 7-year-old should have. Jasper had flinched when a security guard walked too close. Leo had asked if Ethan was going to leave, like the last man who said he'd help. Those words were heavier than any financial projection or market shift. He began making calls. Quietly at first. A friend at the Department of Social Services, a lawyer he trusted, a doctor who owed him a favor. He wanted to find a legal path forward. Custody. Protection. Anything that could make this real. But bureaucracy doesn't care about good intentions. It moves like molasses, especially for people without papers, without clean histories, without convenient origins. The boys had no known relatives, no birth certificates on file. They were ghosts in the system, untraceable and, in the eyes of the state, disposable. When word got out that Ethan Cole, one of the most powerful men in Silicon Valley, was trying to take custody of 3 homeless children, the reaction was swift and brutal. The media latched onto it like sharks in bloodied water. Headlines ranged from concern to scandalous: tech titans midlife crisis? Billionaire street kids, charity or cover-up? News crews started camping outside his building. Investors called emergency meetings. His board was livid. "You've compromised the company's image," one director snapped during a tense video call. "Your actions are becoming a liability." Ethan sat there, listening, his face calm but unreadable. Liability. That was the word they used. As if compassion was a breach of contract. As if children were a scandal. He was given an ultimatum. Step back from the situation. Let public relations manage it. Distance himself. Focus on his duties. Be the man they had built their empire around. Not some savior on a sidewalk. Not some reckless father figure chasing ghosts. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed, the city glowing dimly beyond the windows, and thought about all the things he'd built. All the deals, the speeches, the launches, the relentless pursuit of progress. And yet, none of it had ever filled the silence inside him. None of it had given him what sitting beside three boys beside a fire had. Connection. Meaning. Purpose. By morning, the decision was made. He called a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones extended like claws. Ethan stepped up to the podium in a simple sweater, no suit, no tie. Just a man who had made up his mind. I've spent most of my life chasing numbers, he began. I've built things that changed the world. But I forgot how to feel anything real. Until I met three kids who reminded me what it means to care about someone more than yourself. The room fell still. I'm stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. I'm not retiring. I'm choosing something better. Reporters erupted. Questions flew. He didn't answer them. He walked out, straight to his car, straight back to that corner of the city that no one wanted to see. Where three boys waited, unaware that a man had just given up an empire for the chance to keep a promise. He arrived with nothing but his jacket and a small smile. "We're going home," he said. The boys didn't ask questions. They just followed. The house wasn't a mansion. It wasn't perched on a cliff or hidden behind gates. It wasn't the kind of place you'd see in magazines or luxury listings, and Ethan liked it that way. It was a two-story craftsman home tucked into a quiet neighborhood outside the city, with a wraparound porch, creaky wood floors, and a backyard that smelled of pine and old earth. It was the kind of place made for living, not for showing off. And for the first time in his life, Ethan bought something not because it was impressive, but because it felt safe. The boys stepped inside cautiously, their steps hesitant, eyes darting around like they were waiting for the trap to snap shut. The living room was warm, with soft light and the faint scent of something baking. Ethan had burned 2 attempts at frozen cookies earlier but refused to give up. There were blankets on the couch, shelves filled with books, a big table they could all eat at together. Upstairs, 3 rooms had been prepared, each one different, one with a space theme, another with walls covered in maps and stars, and the last with soft, calming colors and shelves filled with picture books and crayons. Ethan had picked each thing himself, learning what he could from their conversations and from what little they let slip about the things they missed. But the boys didn't run into their rooms. They didn't tear open drawers or bounce on beds. They just stood there, huddled near the door, as if they expected someone to come yelling, to tell them it was a mistake, that they didn't belong here. Leo clutched the sleeve of Aiden's jacket. Jasper kept glancing at the windows, like he was already planning an exit. Ethan didn't push them. He just knelt down in front of them and said, very softly, "No one's going to take this from you. Not now. Not ever." They didn't respond. But they didn't run either. That night, all 3 curled up together on the floor of the smallest room, the one Ethan had designed for Leo. Blankets wrapped tight around them, eyes wide open even in the dark. Ethan sat in the hallway, leaning against the wall outside their door, listening. He didn't leave. Not when his back ached. Not when his phone buzzed with missed calls and emails from the outside world. He stayed. Days passed. Then a week. And slowly, the walls between them began to crack. Aiden started asking questions. Jasper began sitting beside Ethan at breakfast, though he still didn't say much. Leo, sweet Leo, began humming to himself again, especially when Ethan cooked pancakes, which he did badly, but enthusiastically. The house became a rhythm, full of quiet sounds, footsteps on stairs, laughter from the backyard, the buzz of cartoons on Saturday mornings, the scrape of crayons on paper. Ethan had never known how much noise a home could hold. And he had never realized how beautiful that noise could be. He started reading to them at night. At first, they only listened from across the room. Then from the edge of the bed. Eventually, they all curled up around him, one by one, like puzzle pieces falling into place. The first time Jasper reached for Ethan's hand, it was so subtle he almost missed it. A light tug. A silent trust. Ethan held it like it was made of glass. One night, Leo fell asleep on Ethan's chest, breathing softly, fingers clutching the fabric of his shirt. Aiden whispered from the doorway, voice almost too quiet to hear, "You're not like the others." Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was too tight. By the end of the second week, Leo began calling him Dad. Not every time. Not in public. But in those quiet, sacred moments when no one else was listening. The first time it happened, Ethan froze. Then, without even thinking, he whispered back, "Yeah, buddy?" The word settled into him like a key turning in a long-forgotten lock. It wasn't all easy. There were nightmares, moments of panic, sudden withdrawals. Aiden still checked the locks on the doors 3 times before bed. Jasper didn't like strangers, not even the kind delivery man who brought groceries. Leo sometimes cried for no reason and didn't know why. But they weren't surviving anymore. They were healing. Together. And for the first time since he was a boy himself, Ethan didn't feel like he was waiting for something to begin. He was already living it. He didn't need stock charts or quarterly goals or applause from a stage. He had warm mornings, and sticky pancake fingers, and 3 boys who slowly, quietly, started to believe they were safe. He wasn't building an empire anymore. He was building a family. The calm didn't last. It never does, not completely, not when something this good is built on ground that once shattered beneath you. It began with a knock on the door that came too early on a Saturday morning, the kind that made Ethan's stomach twist before he even reached the hallway. The boys were upstairs, still in pajamas, watching cartoons with half-eaten bowls of cereal. He opened the door expecting a package. Instead, he found a woman standing on the porch, arms crossed, eyes sharp and unapologetic. Her voice was smooth, too smooth, rehearsed like a speech she'd delivered 100 times. She introduced herself as Carla, said she was the boys' maternal grandmother. Said she'd only just heard about what happened, and she'd come to take them back where they belonged. Her tone was flat, like it was a legal transaction. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Ethan stood there, stunned, unsure what he was even hearing. The boys had never mentioned a grandmother. He asked for proof. She handed him a folder with a few birth records, her ID, and a lawyer's letter, already typed and waiting. Ethan didn't invite her in. Instead, he closed the door slowly, locking it behind him, heart pounding. He went straight to Aiden, who paused the show as soon as he saw Ethan's face. Ethan asked, carefully, if they knew a woman named Carla. The answer came too quickly. Aiden said, "She used to scream at Mom. She tried to take us once. After the fire, she disappeared." That was all Ethan needed to hear. By Monday, a legal storm had rolled in. Carla had filed for emergency custody, claiming Ethan had no right to harbor the children. That was the word they used, harbor. Like they were fugitives, not 3 scared boys who finally had warm beds and someone who kissed them goodnight. Ethan's lawyers got involved immediately, but even they seemed nervous. Carla had paperwork, blood relation, and the law tends to favor biology over bond. The boys could feel the shift before anything was said. Aiden became colder, more protective. Jasper stopped eating again. Leo began wetting the bed, too ashamed to tell anyone. They sensed that the world outside the house was trying to reach in and rip everything away. And Ethan, he felt powerless for the first time in years. No amount of money or influence could guarantee safety. Not yet. Then came the court date. It was raining that day, hard and cold, like the sky itself was warning him. The courtroom was full of eyes, lawyers, social workers, a judge with deep lines on his face and a tired look that made Ethan wonder how many broken families he'd seen in his life. Carla sat smugly with her attorney, dressed in muted gray, playing the part of a concerned grandmother. She talked about stability, about blood ties, about Ethan's inexperience with children and his questionable motivations. She painted herself as the only logical guardian. Ethan didn't give a speech. He didn't cry. He simply spoke the truth. He told the court how he'd found them. How no one came for them. How they huddled together in fear and silence, and how he didn't walk away. He spoke about Leo falling asleep on his chest, about Jasper's quiet bravery, about Aiden's sharp mind and heavy heart. He didn't describe them like they were burdens or charity projects. He described them like they were his sons. Because they were. The judge listened. And then, to everyone's surprise, he asked if the children would like to speak. Ethan hesitated. But Aiden stood up before anyone could stop him. His voice was small, but steady. "If you send us with her," he said, nodding toward Carla, "we'll run away again." The room went silent. "She doesn't want us. She just wants what comes with us." But Aiden turned to look at Ethan, "He chose us. He didn't have to. He just did." Leo started crying. Jasper took his hand. And in that moment, it was painfully, beautifully clear, this wasn't about legality. It was about love. The judge looked down at his papers for a long time. Then, without much ceremony, he ruled in Ethan's favor. Full guardianship was granted, effective immediately. Carla stormed out before the final words were spoken. Ethan didn't move at first. He just sat there, stunned, hands trembling slightly in his lap. Then Leo ran into his arms. Jasper followed. Aiden hung back for a second, eyes wide and wet, before walking over slowly. He didn't say anything, just leaned in and let Ethan hold him too. That night, they celebrated with pizza, apple juice, and pillows thrown all over the living room floor. They stayed up too late, laughed too hard, and for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel like they were waiting for something to go wrong. They were safe. They were family. And no one could take that away. Not now. Not ever again. Summer came slowly that year, like the world had finally decided to take a breath. The air was warmer, the days longer, and the house that once echoed with uncertainty now pulsed with life. Every window was open, every door left ajar, as if the house itself had grown confident in its purpose. It no longer felt like a shelter or a temporary stop. It was a home. And in that home, something remarkable had started to bloom: freedom. Aiden, always the protector, had slowly allowed himself to just be a kid. He took over the garage, building things from scraps and leftover wood, birdhouses, broken radios turned into speakers, an elaborate treehouse blueprint that now sat taped to the fridge like a sacred document. He started reading, too, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Sci-fi mostly. Stories about distant galaxies and kids who saved the universe. Ethan caught him writing once, late at night, scribbling ideas into a worn notebook under a flashlight. He didn't interrupt. He just smiled and let him be. Jasper found his voice in quieter ways. He took to puzzles, chess, and music, often sitting by the window with headphones on, sketching shapes that made no immediate sense but always turned into something beautiful. He didn't say much, but when he did, it mattered. One day, without warning, he looked up from his drawing and said, "You don't have to keep proving you're a good dad. We already know." Ethan had to leave the room for a minute after that, just to breathe. And Leo, sweet, imaginative Leo, became the sun around which everyone else rotated. He sang in the mornings, made up games with ridiculous rules, gave nicknames to everything, including the toaster, Sir Crunch-a-Lot. He drew comic books with Ethan as the hero, a caped figure named Super Dad, who saved the day using hugs, pancakes, and super hearing. Every page was filled with love. One night, Leo fell asleep with the latest issue in his hands, and Ethan sat beside him for hours, flipping through the pages, overwhelmed by the weight of what it all meant. The rhythm of their lives became steady, filled with traditions they made up along the way. Friday night was movie night, complete with popcorn and debates over which superhero was the strongest. Saturday mornings meant pancakes, burnt or not, and Sundays were reserved for long walks through the woods behind their house, where Leo always insisted on being the trail leader. There were scraped knees, spilled milk, tantrums over bedtime, and quiet apologies whispered in the dark. But those moments were stitched together with laughter, honesty, and something Ethan had once believed he was incapable of giving, unconditional love. Outside their bubble, the world kept watching. The story of the billionaire-turned-father had gone viral months ago, but it hadn't faded. Instead, it grew. Not because Ethan fed the fire, but because people saw something in it they desperately needed to believe in: transformation. Redemption. The idea that even someone who once lived in glass towers could find his soul at ground level. Documentaries were proposed. Interviews requested. Book deals landed on his doorstep. Ethan turned most of it down. But there was one thing he said yes to: a foundation. He launched it quietly, without ceremony or press, using his own money and the tech infrastructure he'd spent a decade building. Code for Kids. A program that offered tech education, mentorship, and resources to foster children, homeless youth, and teens aging out of the system. The application portal opened online one morning with a single quote on the landing page: "Every child deserves someone who won't leave." Within weeks, thousands had applied. Ethan spent his evenings working on the foundation after the boys went to bed. It didn't feel like work. It felt like something he was meant to do. Sometimes, he'd catch himself smiling in the middle of writing code or planning a scholarship structure, and he'd realize that for the first time, he wasn't chasing success, he was planting it. One night, after a particularly long day filled with spreadsheets and bedtime stories, Ethan stood in the kitchen, watching the boys asleep on the couch, tangled in blankets and limbs. He turned off the lights, one by one, and whispered, "Thank you," into the dark. He wasn't sure who he was thanking. Maybe the universe. Maybe the broken pieces of his past that somehow led him here. Or maybe the three boys who gave him the one thing he thought he'd never find: a reason to stay. It was a warm September afternoon when Ethan realized he no longer measured time the way he used to. There were no quarterly deadlines, no frantic back-to-back meetings, no launch schedules pinned to the walls. The calendar on the fridge was now filled with birthday reminders, school field trips, dentist appointments, and a giant red circle around family camping weekend, which Leo had drawn himself with a marker that bled through the paper. Time, now, moved in memories rather than metrics, and that simple truth made every hour feel more alive than any year he had spent in the glass towers of the tech world. The house had changed, too. Not just in furniture or decor, but in its soul. It had been transformed from quiet and sterile to loud and beautifully chaotic. There were toys under the couch, mismatched socks in every corner, and fingerprints on every window. The walls were now covered in artwork, some framed, most taped, and the floors bore the scars of scooter wheels and running feet. Ethan didn't mind the mess. He loved it. Because it meant the boys felt safe enough to take up space. Aiden had started middle school and was taller now, with shoulders that hinted at the man he would one day become. He still watched out for his brothers, but now he also looked out for Ethan. One evening, when Ethan was late picking them up from school, Aiden climbed into the car, gave him a serious look, and said, "You okay? You've been working late again." It was gentle, but honest. Ethan had smiled, ruffled his hair, and said, "Thanks for checking on me." That's how their bond had grown, through quiet, mutual respect. Jasper had joined a local chess club and, within 2 months, was beating kids twice his age. His drawings had grown more detailed, more intricate, now pinned proudly on the kitchen corkboard. He once left a sketch on Ethan's desk, folded in half, no explanation. When Ethan opened it, it was a picture of the 4 of them, him and the boys, holding hands in front of their house. At the top, Jasper had written one word in careful, block letters: home. Leo, ever the dreamer, had started writing stories of his own, always starring a character named Captain Dad, who fought villains with kindness and pancakes. He read them aloud to Ethan at night, his voice full of excitement, stopping often to add new plot twists mid-sentence. Ethan listened to every word, always amazed by how someone so small could carry so much light inside him. Leo still called him Dad without hesitation, and every time he did, it hit Ethan like the first time all over again. They had traditions now. Saturday mornings were still for pancakes, but they had become a full ritual: Leo on fruit duty, Jasper on table setting, Aiden on quality control. They had a garden out back where each boy picked one thing to grow: tomatoes, carrots, and strawberries, and they all took it more seriously than any board meeting Ethan had ever attended. Every Friday night was movie night, with a new rule: no phones allowed. Not even Ethan's. He didn't mind. He liked being unreachable for a little while. And then there were the quiet moments. The ones no one ever talks about, but that meant everything. Like when Jasper crept into Ethan's room during a thunderstorm and curled up beside him without a word. Or when Aiden asked Ethan to come to school for Dad Day and introduce himself to the class. Or when Leo had a nightmare and whispered, "Can you stay until I fall asleep?" Ethan always stayed. Every time. Professionally, the foundation had grown beyond what he imagined. It had offices now. Staff. Volunteers. They were launching pilot programs in 3 more states and had helped over 2,000 kids in just 1 year. But Ethan never let it consume him. He worked after bedtime stories, during school hours, or in the early mornings when the house was still and peaceful. He had finally found a balance he'd once believed didn't exist. The media still tried to follow him sometimes. He didn't engage. He gave a single interview to a local journalist who had grown up in foster care. The headline read, "He didn't rescue them. They rescued each other." That was the only story Ethan felt was worth telling. One night, as fall began to roll in and the leaves turned gold and brittle, Ethan stood on the porch with a blanket around his shoulders and watched the boys through the window. They were inside, wrestling over the last cookie, laughing so hard they couldn't breathe. The house glowed with the soft, flickering light of a fireplace that barely worked but was always lit. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Cole wasn't searching for more. He had everything. Not the things he once chased, power, wealth, recognition, but the things that truly mattered. Arms that reached for him when the nightmares came. Voices that called him Dad. A home where he was needed, wanted, loved, not for what he could give, but simply because he stayed. There was a small wooden sign above the front door now, painted in uneven strokes by Leo and signed by all 3 boys. It read, "Built with love, not luck." Every time Ethan passed beneath it, he touched the edge without thinking, like a quiet ritual of gratitude. In the end, his greatest creation wasn't the tech empire he'd once ruled. It was a life. A real one. And in that life, surrounded by chaos and crayons and love, Ethan Cole had finally found what he didn't even know he was looking for. Peace. What makes this story unforgettable isn't that a billionaire changed the lives of 3 homeless boys, it's that those boys changed his. In a world obsessed with power, image, and perfection, Ethan Cole's journey reminds us that the deepest form of wealth is not measured in dollars, but in connection, vulnerability, and love that doesn't ask for anything in return. He didn't find redemption in headlines or legacy, but in bedtime stories, burnt pancakes, and 3 small hands reaching for his in the dark. It's a quiet kind of heroism, the kind the world doesn't always celebrate, but maybe it should. Because sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is simply stay.